In the far northwest corner of the Soviet Union, deep within the Kola Peninsula, where the Arctic Circle cuts through barren tundra and ancient bedrock, Soviet engineers, in May of 1970, began drilling a hole that would eventually reach deeper into the earth than any human excavation before or since. The Kola super-deep borehole, as it came to be known, represented one of the most ambitious scientific undertakings of the Cold War era, a project that would consume 2 decades of effort, tens of millions of rubles, and the careers of hundreds of Soviet scientists and workers. What began as a straightforward scientific expedition into the Earth's crust became something far stranger, a journey that challenged fundamental assumptions about geology, pushed Soviet technology to its absolute limits, and ultimately ended not with triumph, but with abandonment and mystery. The story of why the Soviet Union poured such enormous resources into drilling this hole, and why they eventually sealed it and walked away, reveals much about the nature of Cold War competition, the Soviet approach to science, and the humbling realization that some frontiers resist even the most determined human efforts to conquer them. To understand why the Soviets embarked on this extraordinary project, one must first grasp the context of Cold War scientific competition in the late 1960s. The space race had captured global attention, with the Soviet Union achieving early victories like Sputnik in 1957 and Yuri Gagarin's orbital flight in 1961, only to watch the United States claim the ultimate prize with the Apollo moon landings beginning in 1969. The Soviets needed new frontiers to demonstrate their technological prowess and the superiority of their scientific establishment. While Americans looked upward to the stars, Soviet planners decided to look downward, into the Earth itself. The logic was compelling. Humanity knew more about the surface of the moon than about what lay beneath their feet. The deepest mines reached only a few kilometers down. Scientific understanding of the Earth's interior relied almost entirely on indirect evidence, seismic readings, and magnetic field measurements, and theoretical calculations. Direct observation of the deep crust and potentially the mantle beneath remained an unexplored frontier, and the Soviets intended to be the first to reach it. The project was conceived within the Soviet scientific establishment as early as 1962, when the Ministry of Geology began seriously considering the feasibility of ultra-deep drilling. The initial proposals emerged from a combination of genuine scientific curiosity and geopolitical calculation. Soviet geologists wanted to test fundamental theories about the composition and structure of the Earth's crust. They wanted to understand how temperature and pressure changed with depth, to examine the transition zones between different rock layers, and to investigate the mysterious Mohorovičić discontinuity, the boundary between the Earth's crust and mantle that had been detected through seismic waves but never directly observed. The Moho, as scientists called it, was believed to lie roughly 30 to 40 kilometers beneath continental surfaces, deeper under continents than under oceans. The Americans had already attempted to reach the Moho through Project Moholy in the early 1960s, drilling from a ship into the ocean floor off Guadalupe Island, where the crust was thinner, but that project had been plagued by technical difficulties and cost overruns before being cancelled by Congress in 1966. The Soviet leadership saw an opportunity. Where the Americans had failed, the Soviets would succeed. The site chosen for the drilling was carefully selected after extensive geological surveys. The Kola Peninsula offered several advantages. It was located in the Baltic Shield, one of the oldest exposed rock formations on Earth, with bedrock dating back more than 2.5 billion years to the Precambrian era. This ancient geology promised unique scientific insights. The region was also politically secure, far from Soviet borders, with existing infrastructure from nearby mining operations and the city of Zapolyarny. The specific drilling site was established near the small settlement of Zapolyarny, about 10 kilometers from the Norwegian border, at coordinates that would become famous in geological circles. The remoteness provided security, and the harsh climate, while challenging, was something Soviet engineers had extensive experience managing. On the 24th of May, in 1970, the Uralmash 4E drilling rig began turning, and the Kola Super Deep Borehole project officially commenced. The drilling method employed was not the rotary drilling familiar from oil exploration, where a drill bit is turned continuously. Instead, the Soviets used turbodrill technology, a Soviet innovation where drilling fluid pumped down the drill pipe turned a turbine connected to the bit, allowing for higher rotation speeds and better performance at extreme depths. The drill string itself was a marvel of engineering, consisting of hollow pipes that could be assembled and disassembled in sections, allowing the bit to be replaced when it wore out, which happened frequently. The initial progress was remarkably swift by the standards of ultra-deep drilling. Within the first year, the borehole had reached a depth of more than 7,000 meters. The rock cores brought to the surface were immediately analyzed in laboratories established on site, and the data began flowing to geological institutes in Moscow and Leningrad. Soviet scientists were ecstatic. The project was working exactly as planned, and the scientific discoveries were already exceeding expectations. What the drill cores revealed challenged existing geological theories in fundamental ways. At depths where rocks were expected to be dense and compressed, Soviet geologists found instead fractures and porosity, open spaces filled with highly mineralized water. This was extraordinary. Conventional wisdom held that the immense pressure at such depths would close any fractures and squeeze out any fluids, yet here was evidence of water circulation at depths approaching 10 kilometers. The temperatures encountered were also higher than predicted by existing models. Calculations based on surface measurements and theoretical heat flow suggested that temperatures at 7,000 meters would be around 100 degrees Celsius, but actual measurements showed temperatures exceeding 180 degrees. This discrepancy suggested that heat transfer within the Earth's crust was far more complex than scientists had assumed, with implications for everything from geothermal energy to volcanic activity. The rocks themselves told stories of unimaginable violence and transformation. Samples showed evidence of ancient metamorphic processes, where heat and pressure had fundamentally altered the mineral structure, and some cores contained microscopic fossils of single-celled organisms from when the Earth was young and life was just beginning. By 1979, the Kola borehole had reached a depth of 9,583 meters, and the Soviet Academy of Sciences announced this achievement with considerable fanfare. The project had already exceeded the depth of the deepest mine in the world, the Western Deep Levels gold mine in South Africa, which reached approximately 3,500 meters. The Soviets were now drilling in territory no human had ever accessed. The propaganda value was significant. Soviet media presented the Kola project as evidence of socialist scientific achievement, proof that Soviet technology and Soviet determination could accomplish what capitalist countries could not. International scientific journals published papers by Soviet geologists describing the discoveries, and the project gained recognition in the global scientific community. The drilling continued deeper, 10,000 meters, 11,000, 12,000. Each kilometer took longer than the last, as technical challenges multiplied. The extreme temperatures caused the drill bits to wear out faster, sometimes after drilling only a few meters. The rock at these depths behaved in unexpected ways, becoming plastic under the intense heat and pressure, flowing back into the borehole after the drill passed through. A phenomenon that had not been anticipated and which required constant redrilling of sections that had already been completed. In 1983, after 13 years of continuous drilling with only brief interruptions for maintenance and equipment replacement, the Kola super-deep borehole reached a depth of 12,000 meters, 12 kilometers straight, down into the earth. This was a psychological milestone, and the drilling team celebrated even as they prepared to push deeper. The target remained the Mohorovičić discontinuity, still believed to be within reach at perhaps 15 or 16 kilometers depth, based on seismic data from the region. The Soviet leadership continued to fund the project generously, seeing it as a matter of national prestige. But the deeper the drill went, the more hostile the environment became. At 12,000 meters, the temperature was measured at approximately 220 degrees Celsius, far higher than any previous prediction. The drill string itself, extending 12 kilometers from the surface to the bit, became increasingly difficult to manage. The weight of the pipe was enormous, and the thermal expansion from the temperature differential between the cool surface and the superheated depths caused constant mechanical stress. Engineers had to develop new drilling fluids that could withstand the temperatures without breaking down, and new materials for drill bits that would not melt or shatter under the conditions. The drilling continued through the mid-1980s, but progress slowed to a crawl. In 1984, after reaching 12,262 meters, disaster struck. The drill string snapped, leaving the bottom 5,000 meters of pipe, and the drill bit stuck in the hole, irretrievable. This was a catastrophic setback. The only option was to seal off the lower section and start drilling again from a shallower depth, essentially creating a branch in the borehole. The team backed up to 7,000 meters and began drilling at a slight angle, creating what became known as the SG3 branch of the borehole, while the original shaft, now blocked, was designated SG2. The new drilling proceeded through 1985 and 1986, retracing much of the depth that had been lost. But the delays were costly and frustration mounted. The project was consuming resources at an accelerating rate. Each meter of progress required more time, more money, more replacement parts, and more human effort than the meter before it. The specialized drilling equipment was breaking down constantly under the extreme conditions, and replacement parts had to be manufactured specifically for this unique application. In 1989, the drill finally reached 12,262 meters again, equaling the previous depth record, and then pushed beyond it. On the 11th of June in 1990, the Kola super-deep borehole reached its maximum depth of 12,262 meters, or 12.262 kilometers, or approximately 7.6 miles. This remains to this day the deepest hole ever drilled into the earth by humans, a record that has stood for more than 3 decades. The achievement was announced by the Soviet Academy of Sciences, and the drilling team prepared to continue deeper, aiming for the elusive goal of 13,000 meters and beyond. But the project had reached its breaking point, both literally and figuratively. The temperatures at the bottom of the hole were now measured at approximately 270 degrees Celsius, far beyond what any drilling equipment could reliably withstand for extended periods. The rock at these depths was so hot and so plastic that it behaved almost like a viscous fluid, and maintaining the integrity of the borehole became nearly impossible. The drill bits were lasting only hours before failing completely, and the cost of each meter of progress had become astronomical. More critically, the Soviet Union itself was collapsing. By 1990, the political and economic structures that had supported the Kola project for 2 decades were disintegrating. The reforms initiated by Mikhail Gorbachev, Glasnost, and Perestroika had unleashed forces that the Soviet leadership could not control. Eastern European communist governments were falling one after another. The Berlin Wall had been breached in November 1989. Nationalist movements were gaining strength across the Soviet republics. The economy was in crisis, with shortages of basic goods and growing unrest among the population. In this context, the enormous expense of drilling ever deeper into the earth for purely scientific purposes became impossible to justify. The Ministry of Geology, which had funded the project, was facing severe budget cuts. The Soviet Academy of Sciences was struggling to maintain funding for essential research. The Kola super-deep bore hole, once a symbol of Soviet technological prowess, now seemed like an expensive relic of a different era, a monument to ambitions that the dying Soviet state could no longer afford. The decision to halt drilling was made sometime in late 1990 or early 1991, as the Soviet Union entered its final months of existence. The official explanation given was that the extreme temperatures and difficult rock conditions made further drilling technically unfeasible with existing technology, which was true enough. But the underlying reality was financial and political. There was simply no money to continue, and no political will to find it. The drilling rig was shut down, and the team of scientists and engineers who had dedicated years or even decades to the project began to disperse. Some continued research analyzing the vast amount of data and rock samples that had been collected, work that would continue through the 1990s and beyond. Others moved on to different projects or left science entirely as the Russian Federation struggled through the chaotic transition from communism to capitalism. The Kola site itself was maintained at a minimal level, with a skeleton crew keeping the facility from falling into complete disrepair. But active drilling had ceased forever. In the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991, the Kola super-deep borehole faded from public consciousness, but it acquired a strange afterlife in rumor and legend. The remote location, the mysterious depth, and the sudden cessation of work created fertile ground for conspiracy theories and urban legends. Stories circulated claiming that Soviet scientists had drilled into hell itself, that they had lowered microphones into the hole and recorded the screams of the damned, that they had released demons or encountered supernatural phenomena that forced them to seal the borehole in terror. These stories were complete fabrications, originating from a 1989 hoax article in a Finnish tabloid that was later picked up and embellished by religious publications and eventually spread across the early internet in the 1990s. The actual reasons for sealing the borehole were far more mundane, but in some ways more poignant. A story of scientific ambition confronting physical limits and economic reality. The truth about what was found at the bottom of the Kola borehole was extraordinary enough without supernatural embellishment. The scientific data collected over 20 years of drilling fundamentally changed geological understanding of the Earth's crust. The discovery of water at extreme depths, the higher-than-expected temperatures, the complex metamorphic processes, and the unexpected rock formations all challenged existing models and required geologists to rethink basic assumptions. One of the most significant findings was the identification of the transition between granite and basalt rock layers at a depth far different than seismic data had suggested, indicating that seismic velocity changes could be caused by factors other than rock type, such as metamorphic alteration or changes in density due to temperature and pressure. This had implications for how scientists interpreted seismic data from across the globe. The discovery of microscopic fossils at depths of over 6 kilometers was also remarkable, suggesting that life, or at least the remnants of ancient life, had been transported far deeper into the crust than anyone had imagined, possibly through tectonic processes over billions of years. The rock samples themselves became invaluable scientific resources. Cores from the Kola borehole are still studied today by geologists seeking to understand the early history of the Earth and the processes that shape the planet's interior. The borehole provided a direct window into rock formations from the Proterozoic and Archean eons, time periods spanning from 2.5 billion to more than 3 billion years ago, when the Earth was a radically different place. Analysis of the mineral composition, the isotopic ratios, and the structural characteristics of these ancient rocks has contributed to understanding continental formation, the development of the Earth's magnetic field, and the conditions that allowed life to emerge and evolve. In this sense, the Kola project achieved its primary scientific objectives, even if it never reached the Moho. The knowledge gained justified the investment, at least from a purely scientific standpoint, even though the geopolitical prestige that the Soviet leadership had sought became irrelevant with the dissolution of the state that had built it. By the early 2000s, the Kola facility had deteriorated significantly. The harsh Arctic climate, the lack of maintenance funding, and simple neglect had taken their toll. The drilling rig was rusted and inoperable. The laboratory buildings were abandoned, their windows broken, and interiors exposed to the elements. The site became a destination for occasional adventurous tourists and urban explorers who made the difficult journey to the remote location to photograph the ruins and peer into the sealed borehole itself. The actual hole was capped with a heavy welded metal cover, preventing access, but also preventing any possibility of the borehole collapsing or becoming a hazard. Around 2008, what remained of the drilling rig and surface structures was scrapped for metal, leaving only concrete foundations and the sealed borehole itself as evidence that anything had ever happened there. The site today is essentially abandoned, a ghost of one of the most ambitious scientific projects of the 20th century. The question of why the borehole was sealed, beyond the immediate practical and financial reasons, touches on deeper issues about the nature of exploration and the limits of human capability. The Kola project represented an attempt to conquer a frontier that proved far more resistant than anticipated. Unlike space, where the primary challenges are engineering and life support, drilling into the Earth confronts the fundamental reality of increasing temperature and pressure that eventually make it impossible for any material or machine to function. The Soviets pushed technology to its absolute limits and achieved a record that still stands, but they also discovered that some depths remain inaccessible with current or foreseeable technology. The Mohorovičić discontinuity, the original target, was never reached. Seismic data suggests it lies at approximately 35 kilometers depth in the Kola region, nearly 3 times deeper than the borehole achieved. Reaching it would require not incremental improvements in drilling technology, but revolutionary breakthroughs in materials science and engineering that have not occurred in the 3 decades since drilling stopped. The legacy of the Kola superdeep borehole extends beyond its scientific contributions. It stands as a monument to a particular moment in history when Cold War competition drove nations to attempt projects of staggering ambition simply to demonstrate superiority over ideological rivals. The Soviet Union poured resources into ultra-deep drilling for the same reasons it poured resources into space exploration, nuclear weapons development, and massive infrastructure projects to prove that the socialist system could match or exceed the achievements of the capitalist West. The fact that the project ultimately ended in abandonment rather than triumph reflects the broader fate of the Soviet Union itself, a state that achieved remarkable things through sheer force of will and resource mobilization, but ultimately could not sustain the effort indefinitely. The sealed borehole in the Arctic tundra, slowly being reclaimed by nature, is a fitting metaphor for Soviet ambitions generally: bold, impressive, but ultimately unsustainable. For modern observers, the story of the Kola superdeep borehole offers several lessons. It demonstrates the value of pure scientific research, even when immediate practical applications are not obvious. The geological knowledge gained from the project has informed everything from geothermal energy development to earthquake prediction to understanding climate change through the study of ancient rock formations. It also illustrates the importance of international scientific cooperation. While the Kola project was a Soviet endeavor driven by Cold War competition, the scientific papers published by Soviet geologists were read and built upon by scientists worldwide, and the data collected has been shared with the international community. Science ultimately transcends political boundaries, even when politics shapes what science gets funded. The project also serves as a reminder of the physical limits that constrain human exploration. We have sent robots to Mars and probes beyond the solar system. But we have barely scratched the surface of our own planet. The deepest point in the ocean, the Mariana Trench, has been visited by humans only a handful of times. The interior of the Earth remains largely inaccessible and mysterious, known only through indirect observation and inference. Today, as various nations and private companies pursue new frontiers in space exploration, deep-sea exploration, and other ambitious scientific endeavors, the Kola superdeep borehole stands as both inspiration and cautionary tale. It shows what can be achieved through sustained effort and technological innovation, but it also shows that ambition must be matched with realistic assessment of challenges and costs. The Soviet decision to seal the borehole was not a failure but a recognition of limits. An acknowledgement that sometimes the frontier pushes back, and the wise choice is to consolidate gains rather than push forward into diminishing returns. The scientific knowledge extracted from 12 kilometers of drilling was immense. Pushing to 13 or 15 kilometers would have yielded additional data, but at exponentially increasing cost for incrementally decreasing benefit. The decision to stop, while driven by economic necessity, was also scientifically defensible. The physical hole itself remains, a narrow shaft extending deeper into the earth than any other human excavation, sealed and abandoned but permanent in geological terms. The rock cores sit in research institutes, still being analyzed decades later. The data fills archives and databases, still being mined for insights. The scientists and engineers who worked on the project, those who remain alive, carry memories of an extraordinary undertaking, a 2-decade effort to touch a part of the Earth that had never been reached before. The Kola superdeep borehole represents a peculiar category of human achievement, a record that was set not because it was easy or profitable, but because it was possible. Because a state decided that pushing the boundaries of human knowledge and capability was worth the enormous cost, at least until it no longer was. In the end, the Soviet Union tried to dig the deepest hole on Earth because it wanted to prove it could, because it wanted to discover what lay beneath, and because, in the competition of the Cold War, every frontier was a battlefield, and every achievement was a victory. They sealed it not because they found anything terrifying or supernatural, but because they ran out of money, out of time, and ultimately out of country. The hole remains, a monument to ambition, to scientific curiosity, and to the simple fact that the Earth keeps its deepest secrets well guarded, yielding them only grudgingly and at great cost to those determined enough to ask.